You're listening to Now I've Heard Everything. Conversations with the icons of our time.
At some point you realize that no one is going to end this chaos if we do not end it. And I think that's where we as women of Liberia came in 2003.
Nobel Peace Prize laureate Leymah Gbowee. Today on Now I've Heard Everything, I'm Bill Thompson. If men start the wars, is it up to the women to help end them? At the start of the 21st century, the West African nation of Liberia was embroiled in its second civil war. Thousands had been killed. Tens of thousands had been displaced. A young single mother named Leymah Gbowee had enough, and she formed a women's group to help push the nation toward peace. Her movement quickly grew, and its peaceful, nonviolent efforts, including a controversial sex strike, forced an end to the fighting and a peace treaty in 2003. And that, in turn, led to the election of the first modern-day female elected head of state in Africa, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. For their efforts, Gbowee and Sirleaf shared the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize. Later that year, Gbowee wrote a memoir, a book called Mighty Be Our Powers. And that's when I met her. In just a moment, our conversation.
Over a 30-year span, national radio personality Bill Thompson did over 10,000 interviews with people who had a hand in shaping our culture and our society. Here is one of those interviews. Enjoy.
So here now from 2011, Leymah Gbowee. Early on in your book, when you describe the earliest days of the Charles Taylor-led revolution, and people are thinking, they'll take care of it. It'll never get this far. We have nothing to worry about. Just go on with your life. And at some point you realize they're not going to take care of it, and we're going to have to deal with this.
When the war started, I had a father who worked with the government. My mother worked with the government hospital, and they were faithful followers of the government of the day, those regime, which is obvious. A lot of government officials will go. And so every time the conversation started to turn to the war, the government is going to quench that uprising. It's just in a matter of days. And days turn to weeks, and weeks turn to months. And when it wasn't going anywhere, and then years went by, then you realize that even from the onset, initially when the fighting started, people would sit down and say, okay, it will stop, and then I'll go and look for food. They had not learned the trick of going to look for food even as it was on. And eventually they learned to do that. And eventually you learn to survive in the midst of chaos. But then at some point you realize that no one is going to end this chaos if we do not end it. And I think that's where we as women of Liberia came in 2003.
But you also say in the book, accurately so, that women's role in wartime, especially in Africa, is always in the background somewhere. You're the human interest part of the story. You're not the story. The men with the guns, that's the story. The revolution, the power, the destruction, that's the story. Women, you aren't the story. You're the background.
Definitely. You are the ones keeping some communities together. You've stepped into the shoes of men. Previously, the husbands brought the food home. The women are the ones now going to fend for food. In those same communities, the women are the ones negotiating the lives of some of their sons when they get arrested, or there's a false accusation somewhere. They are the ones negotiating the lives. But also, if you look at the way the world see the power play, guns and men equals power. And no one have ever stopped to think, isn't power all about those who owns and controls the community at a particular point in time? Yes, the men owns the guns and they're on the front, but who's actually driving communities? It's the women. And yes, those are not stories that media, because war and like sex is exotic, and those are the things that sell. So no one wants to focus on women going to look for food, dodging bullets, going and then allowing themselves to be raped, to pass through a checkpoint, all of those different things. No one wants to focus on it. But even at that, I think also the other side to it is that is a side that the world has missed. That's the power side.
Now, as the years are going past, it's the 90s are slipping away, your country's at war. Were you, at least in your own mind, somewhere thinking, all right, somebody will take care of this? I mean, some woman will come forward and lead the way. At one point, did you realize nobody's going to do it except me?
I was thinking first Jesus will take care of it, because I had been socialized to believe that, and the book begins with me saying a prayer at a New Year's Eve program, and every year those prayers got answered. So I had such a trusting faith in God at the time that whatever I asked for in my teenage mind, He will grant. And the first, second, third day was, Lord, let this madness go away. It didn't go away for 14 years, but in between those years, I got angry with God, and I stopped trusting and believing like I did before. And when I started working with community people, there were men who would sit and talk, and they seemed to have the answer. So in my mind, I was like, these men are the ones, they are our Gandhis, they are our Mandelas, they are our kings, and they're going to make sure this thing happen. Never. Midway towards, and one imam says, Liberia had gone from bad to worse to ridiculous. When we got to that point of ridiculous, it was at that time that the realization was, wow, if we, as women, bearing the brunt of this war, if we don't rise up and do something, no one is going to do it for us.
Is it a role you would have rather given to somebody else?
I never asked for it. I think I was gently nudged into it, or kind of coerced or arm twisted into it by those very wise women. My role when we started this thing, I thought, would be to provide technical support, technical guidance. I had some ideas of peace building. I'd read King, I read Gandhi, I had some ideas. And these were grassroots women who had never really done a lot of these things. So for me, I'm going to help these women get, and then they were like, no, you are our spokesperson, you are our leader, you are the one we want.
But what great confidence they had in you then. I mean, they wouldn't have said that to somebody that they weren't believing in.
Well, and that's where I take a lot of, I'm grateful for that level of confidence, and till today I'm still grateful to those women. But at that time I did not understand that even me, the one who have gone through all of these things, a single mother of 4, in a relationship that I'm not married to this person, a survivor of domestic violence and different kinds of things, that I had that kind of power. I never really thought I had that kind of power. So constantly, these women had to remind me. It was not a journey that when I got in, I had all this air of confidence. There were days that those that I trusted, I would sit with and cry and say, I can't do this.
In reading your book, it almost sounds as though instead of having the confidence you can do the task, it almost sounded like you do the task and that gives you confidence.
Every day, every activity we implemented that was successful, every interview that I did till today, one of my secrets to doing interviews of always, every time I sit, I say, Jesus, take the wheel. And I constantly go back now. After I fell in love with God again, I go back to the Bible and remember that there's a word that says when you stand before kings and queens, don't worry about what you will say because the Holy Spirit is going to. So I have that belief, and every time I say, okay, Lord, here we go again. And then also I see what I do as a ministry, and there is no way that you can, a vocation, a calling from God, and you can't be doing the work of God and rely on your own strength. Yeah.
Was one of your biggest challenges bringing together Christian women and Muslim women? Because we're talking about people who don't necessarily have the same kings and queens.
The biggest challenge was not bringing them together, was keeping them together. By the time they heard the idea about coming together, they were excited. So they willingly came together. Then they came together, and keeping them together was the most difficult thing. And people would think that, okay, the Muslims were the ones who had the problems. No. It was the Christians coming back and quoting the Bible to me. What fellowship does darkness have with light? What can wood do with... I mean, just different things. And we constantly had to say to them, no. People would have visions. The Lord say we should get away from the... I mean, it was tough. But when we started really using our similarities as women, our collectiveness as mothers, and start putting aside that thing about the way we pray, Christian, Muslim, then the understanding came.
I think the world needs a lot more of that right now.
I think so too.
What is a sex strike?
A sex strike is an act by a group of women to deny sex to their respective partners. We employed that strategy out of frustration. We had been doing our protests and we felt like the good men in our community, the men who did not carry guns, were too complacent. We felt like we didn't want them to come into the streets and protest with us, but we felt like they needed to write opinions, publish statements, encourage their bodies to lay down their arms, and we felt like we weren't getting that kind of thing from them. So at the end of the day, if we denied them the pleasures of being with their wives and their partners, they would take a stand. Were we successful? In the urban areas, we were total failures. In the rural areas, the women were smarter than we were because they went back to their husbands and said, we started this campaign for peace. And a key feature of our campaign is to fast and pray. And fasting is an act of denial. So we cannot have sex as we are fasting for peace. So theirs worked. Because their husbands were also, yes, we need to pray for peace. Theirs worked, but we failed miserably.
Lesson learned. Do you remember the point that, as it were, the tipping point when you realized our efforts are working? We're going to succeed. This is going to work.
Well, yes. When we started, we were a little bit wobbly, and then we went to Parliament, and there was a fight between myself and the Speaker of Parliament. Afterwards, we were still sitting and waiting for Taylor's visit or waiting for him to ask to see us. That was like, in our minds, the endorsement that we had succeeded. The day we sat on that airfield and the Speaker of Parliament came, asked his driver to call me, and I told the driver to tell him to come to me. For me personally, that was my tipping point. When I saw him walk towards us, a light came on in my head that we have some powers and that they're afraid of it. So when we went to meet with Taylor, and they said, after he saw the number of women that came, he said he would only meet with 10. That same light came on in my head. And the women were saying, okay, let the women stay and let's send 10 women up. And I said, no. All of us came to see him. He'll come down and meet all of us. And one of the securities turned to me and said, why do you want to stir up trouble? And I said, it's not trouble. We asked to see him. We are a group. So after a while, he said, yes, he was coming down. The light got brighter also in my head, that there's a recognition that these people are serious about what they're doing.
Was victory ultimately as sweet as you'd hoped it would be?
Victory was challenged, and I think God allowed us to go through what we went through because he wanted to teach us a lesson. We got to Accra in like 2 weeks. They signed a ceasefire. The day the ceasefire was signed, we were posing for pictures with every rebel leader. I think at that moment we were so happy that we forgot the purpose of our being there. 2 or 3 days later, the ceasefire broke. It jolted us back to reality. And these are not sincere men that we're dealing with. So when the peace agreement was finally signed, we were cautious. We could not celebrate too much. And that kind of caution is what we've been treading with over the last 8 years. So we don't allow ourselves to celebrate too long. We're constantly thinking, how do we maximize this gain? Yeah.
Leymah Gbowee is 52 now, and Liberia, although still facing many challenges, continues to make strides toward a full democracy. Now you can get your copy of Mighty Be Our Powers by Leymah Gbowee by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also hear my 2006 interview with another Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Wangari Maathai.
We saw how people in power refused to be the custodians of the resources as they were expected, and instead used their position to enrich themselves with the resources.
And my 1992 interview with Gloria Steinem.
The genius of social justice movements, whether it's the women's movement, the black movement, the Hispanic movement, the gay movement, whatever the movement is, the genius of it comes from people letting others know that you can do it. Together we can support each other and we can make it happen.
And of course we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, a good chuckle to go with your pre-Thanksgiving festivities, my 1998 interview with humor columnist Dave Barry.
In our days, we had 78. We had 45, which had a bigger hole. We don't know why. No one ever knows why. No one has ever explained that to me in a million years. Then we had 33, which had the same size hole as 78. But our records, so we had 3 different kinds of records all going on. But our record players had 4 speeds.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.